Happy Monday, everybody. Glad to be with you. I haven't been with you as regularly lately as normal, but I'll be back again later this week. So if you're wherever you're watching me now, you can watch us again on Thursday. We're going to have another great guest. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're with us live, I hope that you will start by going into the chat or comment section on whatever social platform you're in and say hello. Tell us where you're listening and watching from. That would be great to know that. But there's an ulterior motive I have in wanting to get you to type, and that is I want you to engage with us in a very sort of practical way. Because you see, if you and I and our guest, who I will introduce in a second, we're all in the same room around a table having a conversation. If you had a question, you would ask it. If you had a comment, you would share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it, right? So you can do that virtually as well. And I hope that you will. So if you do that, if you will engage with us and share your thoughts and questions, a couple of things will happen. We will have a better conversation, and ultimately we'll have a better podcast episode. And if you didn't know, this will eventually be, actually in just a little over a week, will be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. See that up over my shoulder. So what I'm going to do now that we've sort of got ourselves kicked off in the live stream is I'm going to do a countdown where we will actually start the podcast. So this countdown is really for Marissa when she does the podcast trim. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. Perhaps you have taken a class in business. That's business. Let's do that again, Marissa, in 3, 2, 1. Perhaps you've taken a class in business ethics, and while you knew it was important, it probably wasn't your favorite. As the world changes and the role of business has changed, so has thinking about and what's behind ethics in business. Our guest today has a unique perspective on those changes, what is helpful and what is getting in our way. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could be with us live in the future and then be watching them on your favorite social channel. You can get all information about all future live episodes and interact with us and see them sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses, picked from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become more effective, productive, and confident while overcoming some of a leader's toughest challenges. Learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, I'm going to bring in our esteemed guest. There she is. Alison Taylor is here. Let me introduce her, and then we'll dive into our conversation. Alison Taylor is a clinical associate professor at NYU Stern School of Business and the executive director at Ethical Systems. Her previous work experience includes being a managing director and a senior managing director at a variety of organizations. She holds advisory roles with several organizations and is a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Good Governance. She has expertise in strategy, sustainability, political and social risk, culture and behavior, human rights, ethics and compliance, our focus today, stakeholder engagement, anti-corruption, and professional responsibility. She's also the author of the new book, Higher Ground: How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. What an awesome subtitle. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Modern History at Oxford, her MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago, and an MA in Organizational Psychology from Columbia. She grew up in London, which will explain her accent, but she lives in New York now. And Alison, I'm glad to have you as our guest. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
See? Now you all heard the accent, it's not the same as mine. So listen, I want to start, Alison, with sort of the journey. Like when you were 10, you probably didn't think you were going to be a professor talking about business ethics. So like, obviously we don't want the whole life story, but if you can give us sort of the arc that leads you to this place, I think that sets the context for what we'll talk about.
Sure. So it's a good first question. And yeah, no one needs my full life story because we'd be here all day. But I think the question that you're asking really is super fascinating in the context of my career and the questions I'm trying to answer. So I spent time in mainstream management consulting. I spent time in political risk consulting. So where should you invest? What market should you enter and how? Then I spent time in what is often called corporate investigations. So investigating bribery and corruption and money laundering and fraud. And then finally, I spent time in corporate sustainability. So these are all dimensions of how business should operate in society. They're all dimensions of what it takes to do or not do the right thing. And during this journey, what I became fascinated by was how siloed these different areas were, how they didn't talk to each other, and then by extension, how we have all these different ideas and notions of what it takes to be a good or ethical business. And so I started to see this as a real problem. I started to ask questions about why we have one approach in sustainability and another in risk and compliance and another in strategy. And what I've tried to do, maybe over ambitiously, is to bring all those conversations together in this book and to lay out a framework, lay out a way of thinking about ethical and responsible business where you don't need to be deep in one of these siloed functions to get some value from it. So that at least was the idea.
And we're going to get to the book in a second. And actually, we're going to get there right now because there are several things that you say in the book that I thought were perfect sort of stems for our conversation. And here's one of them. You said, you wrote that business ethics is an oxymoron. So I thought on a book, as people know what they know already, they might think that seems like a strange statement for her to make.
No,
So
I challenge that idea, actually. I think this is, in fact, the response I get when I say I work on business ethics to the average person. They either say, well, isn't that a contradiction in terms? Or they say they need all the help they can get. So a lot of people do respond to the idea of business being ethical by saying that's ridiculous, that's absurd, business will never do this. But I don't know about you. I run into a lot of leaders who actually do want to do the right thing, who do want to run good, responsible businesses where employees want to work and customers want to buy from them. It's just how to do that, I think, has become so confusing in today's world. And there's so much debate, there's so much polarization, there's so much disagreement that I think it does feel like it's impossible to even get started.
I actually would take it a step further, that I would say it's not that I know leaders that want those things. I believe it is the vast majority of leaders that want those things. And yet, to your point, it seems harder than ever to do that. What does that look like? What does it feel like? And you sort of answered this question in a way in a minute ago when you said, sort of here or why I put this book together. But I'll just ask it this way. How is the approach that you're describing here, higher ground, how is it different? Or how have you brought some of these various ideas together in unique ways that can help give us a better, more complete perspective on these big picture questions?
Sure. So my perspective is really that business leaders at the moment are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, or Scylla and Charybdis is the Greek myth. So we used to, in the 20th century, we had this idea from Milton Friedman that everyone knows. Milton Friedman's been challenged a great deal recently, that says, focus on shareholder value and don't break the law. And that worked pretty well for quite a long time. It worked quite well for quite a long time to treat questions of ethics as questions of legal compliance. I think you and I can both see, whether it's pressure on climate change or gun control or inequality or the conflict in the Middle East, it's become harder to anchor your ethical decisions to just not breaking the law. And so something has emerged that's very often called stakeholder capitalism, that says, rather, you need to listen to stakeholders, you need to balance their interests, you need to respond to a much broader chorus of voices. my argument is that a lot of that rhetoric, while it's very understandable, is sort of unworkable and impractical in practice because you can't please all the people all of the time. So in the short answer to why my approach is different is I'm not saying go back to Milton Friedman, focus on shareholder value and don't break the law, nor am I saying it's easy or achievable or always a win-win to listen to all your stakeholders. What I'm saying is there are profound strategic tensions and we need help navigating those.
It's so interesting, Alison. You don't know this. I'm about to tell you. What you do know is in the 3 or 4 minutes that we spoke before we went live, that I told you I'm finishing my next book, and the big idea of the book is that flexibility is critical. That there are tensions that we have to manage between. I'm not getting my fingers in the right spot here. That there are tensions that we need to manage between, and it's figuring out where we need to be in that tension on those. What I'm calling a flexor is the key. And that's really what you're saying here. Like Friedman isn't necessarily right. The other side isn't completely right, even though they're both understandable.
Yes.
The reality is it's dealing with the tension in between is what will help move us in the right direction. One of the things I love about the book and about your approach, even though it's published by Harvard Business Press, so it's Harvard Business Review Press, so it's it's very strong academically, but it just makes sense. Like you made the comment, and it's written in here, you can't please all the people all of the time, and like every one of us who's a parent has said that to our kids. Like we know that's true, and somehow we've forgotten that when we're leading our businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think, we have this idea, right, that a different set of rules apply in a business context versus a personal context. And I think that's very interesting because whether it's one example is the rise of this idea that you bring your whole self to work, right? So now something I hear in the classroom is the idea that I should be able to express my personal values in the office. I should be able to work somewhere aligned with my values. I should be able to have this kind of personal impact. And I think that's all understandable. The problem is it really opens up, I think, a lot of very unreal, pressures that are very difficult for leaders to respond to. And to go back to what we were just saying a few minutes ago, it'd be one thing if the Milton Friedman short-term financial reporting pressure had gone away. But what we've really got is a sort of everything everywhere all at once problem where we've got just as much pressure on shareholder value as there has ever been. And now all these new emerging pressures as well. So genuinely difficult, I think, to navigate this, genuinely difficult to be a leader in the 2020s.
So is it fair to say that part of your approach or part of your thesis is that we sort of need to, knowing all of that context that you just discussed and knowing all of the turbulence, right, that you highlight in that subtitle of the book, that we sort of need to remember the basics of why we're in business? Is that fair? And if so, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of my arguments is before promising to make the world better, business leaders should focus on making their own businesses better. So I think there's been a lot of, my friend Clara calls it yodeling. There's been a lot of treating corporate responsibility as PR. There's been a lot of over-promising. There's been a lot of glossy reports looking at all the wonderful things we're doing. And now we've seen this huge backlash against greenwashing and woke-washing and indeed ESG efforts overall. So I think we do need to go back to basics. I do think we need to center our efforts on treating human beings with dignity and respect. I think we need to think about doing no harm and cleaning up our own messes before going out there and expressing very ambitious societal goals. And then I think we need to think very differently about culture and voice and how we bring stakeholders along with us.
So you said something earlier, which is one of the things that I thought a lot about as I read in the book, which was this idea that it's more than just not break the law, right? And then you make a comment about compliance, that compliance, while the goal of compliance is a wonderful thing, I suppose, that compliance itself is getting in our way of achieving what we want to achieve. to me, this is sort of a paradoxical and really interesting thought. And I'd like for you to dive into that a little bit if you can.
Sure. So, I mean, the story of compliance is super interesting because the role and remit of the compliance function has massively expanded. So compliance really comes into being with the federal sentencing guidelines in 1991, and now there are these huge ethics and compliance departments with enormous budgets, enormous staff. And it's kind of interesting, right, that there still seem to be just as many ethical scandals as ever. So I think there are a lot of things going on here. We've seen the evolution in many companies of treating compliance as about deflecting the regulator. So you can tick all the boxes and have this market-leading compliance program and maybe still get into trouble if you're not thinking holistically. You can't treat compliance in a siloed way. We've got another problem, which is that laws across the world are becoming more inconsistent. So if you're operating in both China and the US, it's very, very difficult these days to be legally compliant in both jurisdictions. We've also seen the regulation of environmental and social pressures, which again is really inconsistent across jurisdictions. And then we've got all this kind of zero tolerance bad apple rhetoric that suggests that all compliance teams need to do is find and remove the bad people, and the organization won't have a problem anymore. And I think you can think of numerous examples, whether it's VW or Wells Fargo, or the problems Boeing is having right now, where it's not a case necessarily that there are good people and bad people and you need to get the bad people out, replace the CEO, and there won't be a problem anymore. What we need to think about is structure and strategy and incentives and leadership and culture and the way that they all interact together. So it's not enough to fire wrongdoers. It's not enough even to replace the CEO. You've got to think holistically, and you've got to prepare employees to manage really pressing ethical dilemmas using principles and not rules.
Yeah, it's one of the other provocative statements that you make, that rules can only take us so far. And I have a long-standing love-hate relationship with policy, which is rules, right? That they're often, we become crippled by them because there are so many, and they become counterproductive and even sometimes sending of mixed messages.
Right. You can't design a rule for every eventuality. You know, if you're in the elevator and there's a banana skin on the floor, you want to be like, well, should I, and you can be, is there a rule that says I can pick up the banana skin? Like, you can't design a rule for every eventuality. Human beings, we get overloaded. We can only remember a certain set of things before we can even figure out what's relevant, before we even think about whether the rule's being enforced. So what we really need to do is empower human beings to use their judgment and raise concerns and bring questions to leaders so that they can be debated and discussed. We can't just say zero tolerance and hope everything's going to be okay.
Well, and which takes us back to the idea of making it psychologically safe for people to raise those questions, to ask those questions, to hold each other and leaders accountable. And all of that takes us back to one of the things that you said a minute ago, which is the role of culture in all of this. You talked about that in sort of the broader set of hooking all these things together. It's not just taking out the bad apples. It's not just replacing a CEO. Talk a little bit more from your perspective about how, let me put a little more context around this question. So for those of you that are listening to this podcast, you might be thinking that this is a slightly different sort of conversation than we often have here, right? That this may feel to you like this is a sort of a CEO level conversation that we're having, and it is. And you may be thinking, well, but Kevin and Alison, I'm not a CEO. So, and yet so I want to come back to that point in a second, Alison, but first I want to take to where I was headed with the question, which was about culture, because I would propose that all of us as leaders have a role to play in culture, whether it's the micro culture on our team as it relates to the macro culture of the organization. So let's start there about how you see culture playing into all of this tapestry that we're talking about.
Right. So, I'd say a few things here. One, culture is constantly evolving. You can see cultures get destroyed in a blink. So this is a collective process. It's a collective action problem, and certainly everybody from the bottom of the pyramid to middle managers to CEOs plays a role in shaping culture. The second thing to say about this is that culture is on display as never before. So it used to be we could think of culture as an internal issue and we could control the narrative. Now we can see that corporate culture is kind of out there. We can see what's going on in a lot of organizations. We can think about, for example, employees filming videos of themselves being laid off and putting it on TikTok. We can think about all these kind of leaks of internal emails and leaks of internal decisions and employees challenging senior decisions. So it's really a case now that something I say in the book is we're all cultural auditors now. We're all able to look on Glassdoor, to look at what companies are doing, to look at what employees are saying and figure out if we want to work or buy from that company. So culture's never been more of a strategic advantage, and it certainly isn't just the role and remit of the senior leaders.
Yeah. So then say a little bit more about that last point, right? Like, clearly a lot of the big picture issues you're talking about here span the organizations, have sort of this CEO level, senior level leader bent to them. But what else would you say to the middle manager, the front level leader who happens to be listening? What role do they play, and what advice might you have for them as we try to figure out how, as businesses, to do the right things?
Right. So we talked a little while ago about leaders being stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? You've still got these short-term pressures. Now you've got all these stakeholder pressures, all these pressures to be diverse and inclusive and sustainable. This often plays out, right, with mixed messaging at the top. And that's okay for those senior leaders. Well, it's not really okay. They're facing a lot of pressure as well. But the point I want to make is any tension at the top, any mixed messaging at the top is going to really hit a middle manager. And so where this is ending up, I think, for a lot of middle managers, and I teach a lot of middle managers, is that they're now being told, you've got to drive performance. You've got to drive shareholder value. You've got to be sure that your team is performing. At the same time, you've also got to be inclusive. You've also got to drive psychological safety. You've also got to prioritize well-being and mental health. You've also got to let employees work from wherever they want. And so it may be difficult, right, to both drive performance and well-being and psychological safety. So I think a lot of these pressures are hitting middle managers really, really hard. And there's a lot of demand, right, today that the organization adapts to the individual and not the other way around. And so I think it's never been trickier to be a middle manager, not just that it's never been trickier to be a senior leader.
Yeah, I would agree with you. So I find myself, Alison, doing a podcast every week, talking with really smart people about really important things. And usually by about this time in the conversation, or at some point as I'm reading the book, I identify at least one thing that I will always remember from that person. And what I'm going to put up on the screen next is maybe the thing I will always remember from you. You write it near the very end of the book, and you make this statement. I want you to just comment on it. If you don't wish to be regarded as a hypocrite, think holistically. What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is we have treated responsible business as a messaging problem and a siloed problem. So it is very, very typical, for example, to have a sustainability report that says we really care about climate change. Here are our net zero goals, where maybe the government relations team down the hall is doing something very different with the lobbying budget. And maybe the people designing incentives have not prioritized climate change. So the point I want to make is we talk a lot about corporate hypocrisy. There's a lot of noise out there about corporations being hypocritical and greenwashing and so on. But because a corporation isn't a person with a single brain, you will look like a hypocrite just if you have not aligned your internal departments to the thinking about this topic. We can think about what happened to Bud Light, right? It launched a marketing campaign with a transgender influencer and didn't think, what's the HR strategy? What's the messaging strategy? Have we gone out there and launched this campaign without thinking about the rest of our organization's commitments on these topics? I mean, arguably, right, this brand should have even asked, is this a really good idea, given the identity of this brand? But it's a good example of what can go wrong if you're thinking in a siloed way, rather than saying, before I put my message out there, let's check that, if I'm saying I'm going to prioritize diversity, let's check I've got a good game with my HR policies internally. So I'm not saying this is easy, but what I'm saying is, if we've got this real gotcha mindset, if there's this sort of exhaustion with corporate over-promising in society, that means you need to be really, really careful to coordinate. So, for example, it might be a good idea to have a group of people deciding whether to speak up or not speak up on an issue, and not just delegate it to the communications team.
I love that. So before we sort of round into the last portion of our conversation, Alison, where I ask a couple of questions, I ask all of my guests, I'll ask this. Is there something I didn't ask, or is there something we didn't talk about that you think is important that we do before we start to move to finish?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to say, just because this is called the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I would encourage your listeners to think about how leadership is evolving. There's really interesting evidence that CEO job descriptions have massively changed over the last 15 years. There's academic studies on this. So it used to be much more about technical skills. Are you a former CFO? That kind of thing. Now we see the inclusion of, do you understand sustainability? Can you influence networks? Are you comfortable with questions of diversity? Can you build a coalition? So I think what we're really dealing with here is the evolution of an idea of leadership that says we bark orders from the top, we set strategy, we incentivize people to perform, we sit back and let the money roll in. And now what you really need to do is bring people along with you. So this means much more confidence in social skills, much more ability to negotiate, much more comfort with topics like psychological safety and diversity. And so to me, this is a new vision for leadership that we're really talking about.
Well, and to me, which takes us back to that word that I told you I liked so much in your earlier statement about thinking holistically. To me, exactly. The more effective leaders today have to think more holistically, have to think bigger picture, have to connect the dots in the network in new and different ways than we've necessarily had to do before. I would argue that leaders that could do that before would have been even more successful. Sure. But now we've highlighted that is the secret sauce, if you will. Yeah. I think that's a fair statement. So I have a couple of more questions before we finish, Alison. So first of all, thanks for adding that, because I think that was really an important thing for us to talk about. Now I want to totally shift gears. I want to know what you, Alison, do for fun.
Oh, gosh. Well, I like to read. I like to go to the theatre. What I most like to do is to hike. I have a house in the Catskill Mountains in Woodstock. So we're just coming into hiking season. It's spring right now. I like to go in the woods, in the forest, and listen to the birds and have no mobile phone reception. And I find that's amazing for creativity. It's amazing for ideas. It's amazing for mental and physical health.
Agreed. I just wrote about that. It's going on a newsletter tomorrow, that it's spring and we need to spend some time outside. Yeah. And be reminded that not all change is bad, because the change that we see around us in the spring is such amazing stuff. You mentioned reading, and it's the only thing you knew I was going to ask you for sure. What is it, Alison, that you're reading these days?
Well, I'm about to start Rutger Bregman's book, Humanity, A Hopeful History. I've been told that philosophically it's very aligned with Higher Ground and very aligned with how I'm thinking about the topic. So super excited to be reading that.
You're not the first person on this show that said that.
Oh, amazing. So everyone needs to read it.
There you go. Anything else?
I was really influenced by a book called The Transparency Society by a German Korean philosopher called Bang-Chul Han, that made me think very differently. It's not about corporations at all. It's a book of philosophy. It made me think very differently about corporate disclosure and corporate responsibility. So I've been recommending that book as well.
The Transparency Society and Humanity, both will be in the show notes, and you can take a look at those. So now perhaps the question that you've most wanted me to ask all along, Alison Taylor, where do you want to point people? Where can they learn more about your work? Where can they learn more about the book? What do you want to tell people about all that?
Oh, well, I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn. I post almost every day. I have the most amazing network of people who make the most amazing comments and give opinions on my posts every day. So I'd encourage anyone to join that conversation. I also have a website, alisontaylor.co. There's one L in the Alison, Alison, not spelt the way most Americans spell it. And there's lots more of my articles, chapter by chapter descriptions, links to buy the book, and so on.
Perfect. That is fantastic. Now the question I have for all of you who are watching now live or later, or who are listening to this on the podcast, the question is this: now what? What action will you take now that you've heard these insights? What mental notes did you take, or what physical notes did you take? But not just, this isn't just meant to be an academic exercise, and it's not meant to be solely an entertainment exercise either, but really one that leads you to take some action. And so it is both Alison and I's hope that you take some action from this. Maybe it's for you to bring together, maybe you're in a smaller organization, you want to bring some people together to sort of see about breaking down the silos, to think about some of these things. Maybe what you got is some things to think about how you consider culture differently as it relates to moving your business towards higher ground. I don't know what it is for you. So just a couple of things that I wrote down. Whatever those things are for you, though, that's where the value of this conversation comes for you, is in taking some action. Alison, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. It really was. I'm glad that we had the chance to chat.
It was so great to speak to you, and good luck with getting your own book deadline, latest book deadline over the line.
It's over the line. I mean, I've just got it's over the line already, basically. So everybody, if you enjoyed today, make sure you come back. Make sure to like and subscribe. You know how to do all those things, and tell somebody else to join us, because next week we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.